Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of Team Training Tuesday. We sometimes call it Applied Near Life when we are doing trainings. And if you are a guest, you are certainly most welcome to come and see what we do in this family. We belong to a family on a mission to make the world healthier and free of financial stress. And today we are looking at the topic of lifestyle-induced weight gain and diabetes. We've decided to put the two topics together so that we can address root causes, because I must tell you, the root causes are similar. They are the same. We are presenting together tonight, Edward and myself. The name of our brand is Simply Healthier, and we are on a mission to help families and individuals to shift their focus from being sick to health and wellness. And first of all, I want us to ask ourselves what really led to the disaster of unmanaged weight and diabetes. Well, in a nutshell, it's the refusal to distinguish between refined and rapidly absorbed carbohydrates that increase insulin production quickly and dramatically from complex carbohydrates that do not. And just a quick education, insulin is a hormone that causes fat storage. It actually moderates or intervenes in the absorption of all nutrients. However, if there is resistance to insulin, which is a very common condition, or if it is frequently raised way above and beyond normal, it will be almost impossible to lose weight. So that's point number one. And then secondly, there's another hormone that we call estrogen, which is predominantly a female hormone. But then there are several chemicals that we call xenoestrogens that mimic or antagonize the action of naturally occurring estrogen. And those are what we call hormone disrupting chemicals. They actually disrupt hormonal activity. And that disruption can happen right from infancy or even before birth. That results in adverse health effects, which are seen much later on in one's life, among which are weight gain and difficulty to lose weight. So it is very important to be aware of those facts. Then hormonal imbalance generally. There is a role that it plays, and there are several hormones. I probably can skip this slide. You can look at it later. But those hormones interplay and they create cravings. In other words, the body to crave for certain foods and certain scents and certain even chemicals, by the way. So it is important to know, but on top of it, in the middle, you can see cortisol. Those are the stress hormones. And then insulin, again, that rises in response to food. So it's important to know that. Then also important is to know that we have to keep the liver healthy. The liver is the key detox organ in the body, and hormones are metabolized. In other words, they're broken down and eliminated by the liver. Furthermore, proper elimination is very important to ensure that hormones do not recycle. Unfortunately, in living, a lot of people suffer from constipation, which is failure to eliminate effectively. And then the role of those xenoestrogens that I mentioned must always be on your list of reasons for weight gain and specifically belly fat as well, which is a growing problem. So, the most important first step to overcome these lifestyle challenges, particularly craving for certain foods, is our mindset. Very important. So at this juncture, I'm going to invite Dr. Edward Nambasi. He is my partner in business and in life, and we do this together, and we run our Simply Healthier Wellness together. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to invite Eddie to come along. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to share the presentation with you. I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle and beginning with what we call blood sugar balance, the role of insulin in chronic inflammation. Now, we all are aware that when somebody's
Are you
got a bit of
sharing?
weight,
Sorry, are you
um,
sharing? I don't think so.
hang on a second. Okay, there we go. Okay, let me now put up. Can you see my slides now?
Yes, thank you.
Lovely. No, thank you for that. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I was saying that we are all aware and we've read a lot about what weight, the effect of weight is on our health and all the negative connotations. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to zero in on the role of insulin in chronic inflammation. And to start us off, I'll just take you back to biology for some of us. Some of us will be physiology, to the two organs that are central as far as control of blood sugar in the body is concerned. Sorry about that. I'm trying to see if I can get this out of the way. There we go, that's better. Yeah, so what happens, the pancreas, as soon as there is high sugar in the blood, it secretes insulin. And if you see the red arrow, insulin has several effects. One of them is to encourage the cells to actually take in the sugar from the blood and also transporting it to the liver, where the liver then converts the glucose into glycogen, thereby reducing the sugar levels in the blood. On the other hand, when there's low blood sugar in the blood, signal is sent to the pancreas, witness the blue arrow. If I could show that to you, there that goes. That then secretes a hormone called glucagon, which then instructs the liver to reverse the process of glycogen to glucose, thereby raising the blood sugar again. So, 2 seconds. My slides are not advancing. There we go. The actions of insulin, it's more than just controlling blood sugar. Insulin acts on all the cells in the body. And as we said, it encourages them to take in glucose. And as a result, it has a direct effect on controlling cell growth, the functions of the cell, and the way that the cell utilizes energy. So you can well imagine if it's a cell that's producing hormones, if something goes wrong with insulin, goes wrong with sugar, the hormones are not produced. The other function that insulin does is to store cellular energy. It's to store fat. So if there's too much sugar around and the muscles are unable to burn it, the liver can only store a little small amount, not much. The rest is stored as fat. So that's where insulin now comes in and comes of its own. Normally, our sugar is controlled in a very narrow range between a high of about 7 and a low of about 5. So normally, as soon as you eat some food, the pancreas produces insulin, and this insulin then transports the sugar, as we said, to the cells where they are burnt up, or if there's too much sugar, then it's stored as fat. And that's what happens when it goes above the line of 7 that I talked about. The effect of this high rise of sugar, for example, if you've eaten something that has got a rapid release of sugar, is for insulin to be also released to match that sugar. Now, the higher the sugar, the higher the insulin, and then the bigger the drop in the sugar. So when it drops below the lower figure, the lower dotted line, which is 5 millimoles, or as Americans say, 100 milligrams, then it again triggers the sensation to the pancreas, the message, help, we need more insulin, there's too much sugar. Or rather, too little, sorry. It triggers a message to say that we don't have enough sugar, and therefore it shoots you to a craving, which then pushes you to eat something sweet again. When you do that, the sugar then rises up again, and if it goes beyond the utilization for the cells, it's then stored as fat. And as I said, the liver can only store a certain amount of glycogen. Now, this fat, when it is stored, it is normally stored liver, which eventually then becomes a fatty liver because it becomes abnormal. It's stored around the visceral organs, and that's why the abdominal gas increases. But in addition to that, a high blood sugar damages the arteries and causes a low-level inflammation. And if you can imagine, arteries are everywhere in the body. And wherever there is an artery, inflammation, and that means then the chronic diseases cascade, which we shall have a look a bit later on, is set in motion. On the lower end, when the sugar drops, when you've got low blood sugar, your body shows that as you feeling fatigued, tired, you've got a low mood, you can become very cranky, difficult to concentrate, and cortisol is released. And this is what pushes you to eat. And the cycle then repeats itself. So you are caught up in what we call a roller coaster of up and down, which has become really a challenge these days because of the amount of ultra-processed foods that we expose ourselves to. The more you can keep your sugar on a level between those two dotted lines, the more you have, or rather the less of fat is stored, and the more that you burn in the muscles, which, by the way, is the reason why we say when you've eaten something, it's a good thing to move, because the muscles are some of the biggest burners of excess sugar. And if it's not burnt, then it's stored as fat. How does insulin resistance start? If you look at this diagram, the purple area is a normal cell, and red is the blood vessel. Glucose is represented by the white dots, and insulin by the blue ones. So in a normal situation, the level of sugar and insulin match each other, and sugar is absorbed from the blood and utilized by the cell. So there's no excess left in the blood vessel. On the other hand, if there's too much sugar going into the system, as you can see in the second part over here, then a lot of insulin is produced. And because the cells get an overflow of insulin, eventually they become numb, as it were. And the effect that is reduced is them absorbing the glucose from the blood, and the glucose then tends to stay in the blood. But what is not affected is the growth of the cells and fat storage that continues. despite the cells being insulin resistant. And that's part of the reason why we run into difficulties. The effects of insulin resistance include weight gain, we've mentioned, visceral fat. Chronic inflammation is at the basis of the metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome usually has high cholesterol, obesity, and hypertension. Then other hormonal challenges, for example, polycystic ovary syndrome, which is now known as ovarian syndrome. And that, of course, leads to things like menstrual irregularities, infertility. Then the brain is also affected. And this is where you get things like dementia, Alzheimer's, and of course, type 2 diabetes. And then the plethora of cardiovascular diseases all come as a result of insulin resistance. And I've mentioned fatty liver as well. Insulin resistance is also brought about by other factors, like, for example, genetics. And here, a child is born of parents, one or other parent who was with insulin resistance will also develop insulin resistance. As we age, our cells become more and more resistant to insulin, and we also begin to lose muscle mass. And of course, if you don't have enough muscle to burn the sugar, then insulin is increased, and that's a mechanism by which we get insulin resistant. But this needn't be, as we shall show you just now, when you maintain your blood sugar balance. Stress is another cause of insulin resistance, and this goes via the cortisol pathway, where when you're stressed, you produce a lot of cortisol and adrenaline, and these push the pancreas to produce a lot of insulin, eventually leading to insulin resistance. Other dietary factors, I've mentioned ultra-processed foods, but then there's also the food additives, for example, MSG, which is found in a lot of processed foods, and the dyes that are used for coloring foods. Sleep deprivation can also lead to insulin resistance. Mechanism here is a little bit more complicated, but somehow tied in with our diurnal rhythm, where we have a lot of cortisol when we wake up in the morning. And because the diurnal rhythm is disrupted, this will also disrupt the cortisol production. Insulin resistance goes through stages. And at the beginning, you'll notice that when you've got normal insulin production, the blood sugar remains normal. And then as the sugar begins to increase, insulin is also elevated to match. Insulin is elevated to match the increased blood sugar, and this continues to increase. But at that juncture, when you go to the doctor, they will not pick up any abnormality because the blood sugar is still normal. Despite the elevated insulin, that will still show as a normal blood sugar. Unfortunately, insulin is not a routine test in most hospitals or when you go to see the doctor. But we're hoping that this will become more and more done, especially the fasting insulin, because that gives you an idea as to when you're developing insulin resistance. Stage 2 is when your insulin is elevated to the point that there's glucose dysregulation, as we call it. In other words, for those in the medical field, when somebody's done a glucose tolerance test, this will show impairment and not yet diabetes as such. Then the last stage is when the beta cells in the pancreas actually give up, and then you become diabetic. And this is the stage that we need to try and avoid. So how do we do this? That's why I come in the homeostasis, which means balance. Nature is good at balancing things until man comes into the picture. Then with our development, our cutting down forests and things like that, we end up disrupting this balance. And that's why we end up with a climate crisis. In the body, when we don't maintain homeostasis and a balance, the climate crisis is our chronic infection, rather chronic inflammation, which then leads to unmanageable weight, which also then leads to other chronic illnesses, especially diabetes. I've already told you that glucose is central to body functioning, and that's why insulin has an effect on all the cells in the body. So we cannot do without glucose. And that's why diets that try to cut down carbohydrates drastically sometimes cause issues. And not all carbohydrates are bad, so we shouldn't demonize all of them. There is two categories. There is fast-releasing carbohydrates that is found in things like processed sugar, the ultra-processed foods, where when you eat something, the sugar is rapidly left into the bloodstream, causing a sharp spike in insulin, as opposed to slow carbohydrates, which are actually much better and to be recommended. Things like, for the South African audience, madumbe, those are yams. In Uganda, your cassava, your, again, yams. Things like millet, those are slow carbohydrates. The danger with millet, of course, is that we put in cassava, and cassava powder is actually a fast carbohydrate, as opposed to cooked fresh cassava, which is a slow carbohydrate. This is just to give you an example of what I mean by a good carbohydrate and a bad carbohydrate. In the first picture here, this is 2 slices of white bread with heaps and heaps of jam, which is one of the favorites of the young people because it tastes nice. As soon as you've taken it, it spikes up the glucose to very high levels, as well as the insulin following suit. Contrast that to a more healthy alternative where you've got whole wheat bread or multigrain bread, and then protein in the form of eggs and cheese, and also a vegetable. When you put that together, the insulin rise, as you see on the green curve, is not as sharp as the one we saw on the red curve. And also the insulin doesn't rise as rapidly. This has got a bearing to what I'm going to tell you about now, the blood sugar balance. Now, blood sugar balance is not a strict diet like all the diets that you've heard about. And as a result, it seeks to give you a balance between all the macronutrients that you're taking in your meal, as opposed to limiting or restricting one. And then as you do that, it also seeks not for perfection, but for you to aspire to reach that physiological state where you're able to support the metabolic resilience of the cells, energy regulation of the cells, to control your appetite, and as a result, to have long-term health and wellness. Now, the rules for blood sugar balancing are very simple. In fact, it's a likable one because you actually eat regularly. In fact, some people find that they're eating more, but I'll explain that in a short while. And then you eat regularly every 3 to 4 hours and have a break of 12 hours at least during the night to give your gut a break. The longer you make this break at night, the better, because that gives your gut time to recover. Also gives the bacteria, your microbiome, a chance to recover and repopulate. And then the second rule is that you eat a protein at every meal. The effect of protein on carbohydrate absorption or glucose absorption is to actually slow it down. And so you don't get that spike of sugar, which is very important. That will mean then you won't get a spike of insulin, and therefore you're better able to maintain. And the third one is that you have to be very selective with the type and quantity of carbohydrates that you take. In other words, the type, as we said, the slow release ones, slow release carbohydrate is what you should be taking. quantity is shown in my next slide. And I hope that all your plates of nutrition will look like that as we go forward. A quarter of the plate in a protein-rich sauce, and it gives you some examples there. Pick the ones that are most relevant to us. I know that for our religious grounds, pork may not be a common thing, but in other places it is. And then a carbohydrate one, which is root vegetables, parsnips, carrots, butternut, and whole grains. Whole grains are very important. Brown rice, millet I've mentioned, and whole wheats. So a quarter each of those, protein and carbohydrate. And then for vegetables, the other half of the plate, there you can eat as much as you want. There is no limit to that. But remember that things like fruits are actually sweet and may constitute, some of them have got a very rapid release of sugar. So I'll stop sharing here and hand back to Eseza to continue with the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very, very insightful. And now I will share again so that I get some assistance with presenting. Right. Thank you for your insights. Now, the first thing to do is to get to know your triggers. Don't ignore them. And I just want to say to anybody who is wanting to manage blood sugar and weight, it is never too late to make different choices. So when you know your triggers, such as if you love your cakes and biscuits, get to know, and that is easy easier if you know. Once a craving is established, it becomes harder to deal with as time goes by, and ultimately it can cause disease. That is something to be so aware of. And now we are going to talk about inflammation. Eddie spoke about inflammation quite a bit, but what I want to do now is to pause and we'll record a different part so that we talk about the products that can help us. Let me just pause there.